I guess you could say that I am a fan of these movies. For the most part. Now, I didn't grow up with these ones much as a kid. I've seen them as a kid, I enjoyed them as a kid, but I was always the Spider-Man kid back then. I always watched the Sam Raimi movies way more than I watched these movies. And it's not because these movies are bad, at least most of them. But it's because, more so, I just preferred Spider-Man more. It was more my style. Whereas this one, it was trying to balance between being kid-friendly and also a little bit adult and mature, but it doesn't quite work with that balance. But let me put it this way, most of these reviews are going to be positive. So, there won't be too much negativity in this marathon, not to mention because we're skipping most of the bad ones. So no Origins Wolverine, no Dark Phoenix, no Apocalypse, no mutants, New Mutants. None of those. Here we're just going to focus on the main ones that actually matter. So, let's go through these together, shall we? What's up, what's happening? What's going on? Welcome back to my station. What's your fan? The animation, clean TVs and movies as well. I'm your host, Jackson Small. Welcome to my review of X-Men 2000, the first installment of the second surprise marathon for the month, X Month. A movie marathon where we take a look at most of the live-action movies centered around the X-Men and Wolverine, leading all the way up to Deadpool and Wolverine, which is coming out in less than 2 weeks. So, I rewatched this movie for the first time in a good while. I think the last time I saw this movie was probably around, I want to say 2017, 2018, around the time when Logan was coming out. So, it's been a good few years since I've watched it, but I'm happy to say that watching it now, it's still pretty good. It's a pretty good movie, and I do really enjoy it, and also something I don't think I pointed out enough in my Spider-Man reviews, I am a huge sucker for these 2000s comic book movies. I know a lot of people love to crap on them, but I have a soft spot for them, mainly because these are movies that I grew up watching a lot as a kid. Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy, these movies, even though, like I said, I didn't watch them as much, but they were still there in some capacity. Daredevil, Eric Bana Hulk, all those cheesy movies from the 2000s, Ghost Rider, all of those movies from the 2000s that people crapped on, that I still have a soft spot for and I still enjoy, because they were pieces of my childhood to some extent. So watching all of these now as a 23-year-old adult, you probably expect me to agree with most of the critics and call these movies bad. No, I'm still going to call some of these at least decent. But with this movie, yeah, it's still pretty good. And yes, I was able to find the VHS tape of it a good while ago for a pretty good price. Oh, the amazing things you will find when you thrift shop. So, I have a not too long, but decently detailed written review for this one. So, I hope you guys sit back, relax, and enjoy my review of 2000's X-Men. If I can keep my computer from falling asleep. To be honest, I never really watched this one much as a kid, not because I didn't like it, but more so because I was one of those kids who preferred the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy and the OG 90s Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. That first movie, I watched that so much as a kid. However, in recent years, I have warmed up to it and try to watch it at least once every year or two. And I'm happy to say that even over 20 years later, it still holds up as a pretty good film and a pretty good comic book movie. Hugh Jackman's Wolverine is one of the best castings ever in a comic book movie, as is also Patrick Stewart as Professor X. The story's good and does a solid job replicating the moral complexity of the comics while not going too dark to scare away the kids. The tone, while a bit cheesy, is consistent. Like, these 2000 movies are cheesy. I will not at all deny that. These 2000s comic book movies are cheesy, but they're cheesy in a charming way, more so than in a cringe way. The pacing is good and doesn't feel rushed. The action's really fun, especially in the last third. The final battle of this movie is a lot of fun, on the top of the Statue of Liberty. Magneto is a great villain, portrayed perfectly by Gandalf himself, Ian McKellen, in one of his best-known roles. Ian McKellen is such a good Magneto. They nailed it on the first try with that one. The runtime of over an hour and a half gives the story plenty of time to develop. The movie's about 104 minutes, at least according to the VHS tape back cover. And I think it's a good runtime. It does feel a little bit overly long in a few spots, but It's not to the point of ruining the experience, and I was engaged the entire time. I wasn't bored. That's the highest praise I can give to it. And gives the story plenty of time to develop. The character development, while minimal, is good enough to leave the viewer satisfied. It's not very much a character-driven story. It's more just an overall story about the X-Men and their battle against the Brotherhood and how the humans fall right in the middle of it. The rewatchability gets higher every time a new one comes out, and it's ridiculously funny, with so many visual and written gags that still get a laugh out of me. I mean, there's a scene where Wolverine uses his claws to flip off Cyclops. Need I say more? Yes, it's a little juvenile, but it's still pretty funny. That being said, though, there's still a few imperfections. The rest of the acting is very hit or miss, especially James Marsden, who's just not a very good Cyclops. Like, nothing against James Marsden. If you've watched my Sonic movie reviews, you know I love this guy's performance as the Donut Lord, but I don't know, something about him as Cyclops just doesn't really work and it feels kind of flat. Same goes for his performance in Superman Returns, which we'll talk about at a later date. And Halle Berry's very forced South African accent for Storm, which I get what she was trying to do. She was trying to replicate that same voice from the 90s animated series, but it's nowhere near as good here as it was there. And here, it feels forced and doesn't quite fit her voice, whereas in the 90s animated series, and X-Men 97 for that matter, it fits really well, and it really matches the character. But here in this live-action movie, it just doesn't work. Why she chose that accent, besides trying to replicate that, I don't know. Some of the dialogue is very corny by today's standards. That yellow spandex jab still makes me cringe. Like, why did they write that line in there? Why did they have to throw shade at the beloved yellow and blue spandex? Come on, man. That was unnecessary. And the CGI effects have not aged well. This was the same problem that I ran into with Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 1. The effects have not aged very well, and by most people's standards nowadays, they'd call them awful. Because it's very blatantly obvious that it's CGI, and it doesn't really look all that good. But if it's able to look cool, I'm willing to give it a pass. Like, for example, that scene where it's also in the trailer, spoiler alert, where Wolverine uses his claws to save himself from falling, going around the Statue of Liberty and cutting off a piece with his claws and then going right back on his feet. Like, that scene's cool. There's no wonder why it's in all the trailers for this movie, because it's a cool scene. It doesn't look great, but it's cool. And it was a cool idea that I think they executed visually, despite some of the limitations of the technology from back then. Obviously, it's gotten a lot better since then nowadays, but even by the standards of back then, yeah, it was cheesy. Also, unlike Raimi's Spidey, the suit designs were very boring. I get what they were trying to go for, being a little bit more realistic, but visually, besides Wolverine's and Storm's, it's just not very appealing. Wolverine's, because he does have a cool X across his chest, which does look cool, and it's the one X across the chest you can actually see from all the costumes. And Storm, because she still has her cape, and the cape does have this really cool reflective silver on the inside lining. And when you see that, like, flowing through the wind, it looks really cool. But Cyclops, Jean Grey's, the rest of them, their suits are very boring. And no offense to Magneto's is fine, but it's a little bit too rudimentary. Overall, however, X-Men is still a pretty good comic book movie and deserves its recognition as a landmark film in the subgenre. Like the holy trinity of comic book movies that got comic book movies to the big powerhouses they are today, excluding, obviously, the MCU, were Blade, X-Men, and Spider-Man. Spider-Man being the biggest hit of the three. Sure, it's not as great as the Spider-Man movie that followed 2 years later, but it's still a worthwhile watch for fans of the source material. If you like X-Men, I think you'll really enjoy this movie. Even if you don't like X-Men, I still think you should give it a watch, because it might be just a fun little action movie. And for those that are fans of neither, obviously it's not for you. So, final verdict for the original, 2000's Bryan Singer's X-Men is going to be a solid 7 out of 10. It's a pretty good movie. I had a pretty good time watching it again after all these years. And while some things about it don't hold up, I find more things enjoyable rather than distracting. So, yeah, pretty good, pretty solid comic book movie. I just prefer Sam Raimi's Spider-Man more. It's just a personal preference. So, that's it. We'll see how it continues on next time with the sequel, X2 X-Men United. Weird they gave it a subtitle, but that's what it's called. See you next time for X2.
We cannot take it anymore. The time has come.